Sindana has a question. She asked, in the collaboration between Ambedkarite Buddhists and Japanese, how do the Japanese, who have something similar to a caste class system, view and understand Ambedkarite Buddhists and anti-caste ideas?
That's a fantastic question. As I've been talking with Japanese Buddhists about this and Ambedkarites who interact with the Japanese for a lot longer term than I've been able to interact with them, this is part of why like the registers becomes a big thing for me, that if we shift our attention to a different context, we have to sort of try to think of like, how do Japanese people view religion generally? So the vast majority of Japanese people say they're not religious, even if they're involved in some Buddhist and Shinto and other practices. They say they're not religious. And this notion of like belonging to religion a little bit too exclusively, like Ambedkarite Buddhists very often are, they're Buddhist. They're not something else. That in Japan doesn't resonate very well. There's this sense of like maybe people are a little too interested in religion. And so talking with Ambedkarites and Japanese, when they have like met each other, very often the Japanese people might, ask something like, well, what religion are you? Are you Hindu? Just on the basis idea that, most Indians are Hindu. They say, well, what religion are you? And then the Ambedkarites will say, well, we're Buddhist. And that is the end of the conversation. There's like, the Japanese person might say, oh, well, I am too. But there's not any further discussion about that. Then religion's just sort of off the table again. So yeah, how do they understand caste and class? There are a few, say, Japanese scholars or people who are very interested internationally or in cultural things who will go as far as like trying to understand that. But for a lot of Japanese people, that's just not something that they're going to investigate very far. That's the reality of it, that when we're dealing with cross-cultural encounters, we're dealing with people within their limited scope of what they feel is important and what they're interested in. Trying to communicate what caste is internationally, I mean, I'm sure many of you in the audience here know, it's a really big problem. It's really hard for a lot of people outside of South Asian backgrounds to kind of wrap their minds around how this is, even a thing. And that's the case in Japan too.
Okay, we can move to the next question. Okay, I'll take the question from Arul. So she asked, there was a conversion to Islam in Meenakshipuram of Tamil Nadu, and after 30 years of conversion, Dr. Tirumavalan, sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, studied their quality of life and improvements. His thesis tries to answer why they have converted to Islam, though their leader, Dr. Ambedkar, converted to Buddhism, among many other questions.
So in this context, how do you compare people's conversion to other religions from Hinduism in labor migration pattern, type of jobs, the opportunities they get? That is an absolutely fantastic question. If anybody can help me get a grasp on that, I would love it. That's simply kind of beyond where my research has gone, partially because especially diaspora context gets so complicated. Just trying to find out all of the networks of where Ambedkarite Buddhists have all been has taken a lot of time and a lot of help from, obviously, their communities. A lot of this isn't exactly public knowledge. And so that's just the Ambedkarite Buddhists. Where different groups of, say, Muslims have gone, or say Dalit Christians have gone. I'm sure there's a story there, and I unfortunately don't know it, but I'd be very curious to learn. And how do we, say, compare their conversion and what that means? I think a lot does depend, say, of Christians, for example, thinking especially of South India. The time in when a lot of the conversions happened was the late 19th, early 20th centuries, which is very different than 1956, which is also different than what's being talked about here in Meenakshipuram. So yeah, I think the context in which what religion means for whom at that time, that changes a lot. And it also changes the character of, what it means to belong to that religion. We often say, well, Christianity has this flavor, Islam has this flavor, like somehow the tradition itself does something. I mean, this might already be obvious to people that I'm talking to here, but the tradition is something, but the kind of anti-caste struggle is not limited to the tradition. And so I don't know how much we learn from just the tradition itself. Is a fantastic question. Yeah, would love to be considering it further. And if anybody has, thoughts or, anything to share, maybe we can include my email address somewhere in some of the literature or something. But I'd be very, very happy to be in touch.
Suniti has a question. Do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead?
Hi, thank you for that talk, Professor Keane. And I wanted to ask about I wanted to ask about when you say Buddhism as a social resource, that is the product of what Ambedkarite Buddhism means, and you are posing the question: how does it serve as a social, like what can replace religion in the diaspora to carry forward like shared activities, some kind of sharedness between communities? And I was wondering whether it was a social resource then, because it was supposed to replace Hinduism, which was a major force. And there was an idea that people should not be left empty. So there has to be something that exists to be able to recover from there. And given that now, like Buddhist practice is also mixed with other religious practices, and for a lot of diaspora people who have had mobility, there is not a sense of nothing being there. There are much better ways to access the world to create new like social gatherings, social practices. And I was wondering whether you had an idea of what these diaspora communities are thinking outside of religion, and whether religion does serve as a social resource for politics, and whether politics itself, especially in your book Shared Devotion, Shared Food, Shared Devotion, the idea of commensality without politics is empty, that you can have these practices and still they can mean nothing, and they cannot have a transformation in terms of a anti-caste outlook, or to break barriers but not break caste completely. That kind of a tension that you bring out, that would exist here too, which is that the practice can be there, but without those even if that shared practice exists, without politics, it is kind of empty, right? How do you think about shared practices, about religion in that context, and especially for Maharashtra, which has many practices which are shared, but then don't have that same kind of an effect?
Sure. I mean, this is always there's a spectrum of possibilities. Just because, say, somebody converts to Buddhism doesn't mean that immediately then that Buddhism takes them in an Ambedkarite, socially active political direction. It often does, but it doesn't have to. And especially in diaspora, where like a lot of people, when they think about religion, don't think about that socially active political dynamic, that religion is just sort of a personal belief thing. That is very different than what Dr. Ambedkar was presenting. And so for, say, second or third generation Ambedkarites outside of India, I wonder how they're going to fully even kind of hold on to that at all, because thinking about what religion is very different elsewhere. It does take a conscious effort to hold on to the socially active and religious pieces. So, as you mentioned, I think there were actually quite a few questions in your comment, and what you said here, great ones. I'm afraid I'm going to have forgotten some of them. But the thing that does stand out to me is, so in diaspora communities, for example, people get together for Ambedkar Jayanti. Does Ambedkar Jayanti, do you bring in a monk? Does he chant in the beginning? Some communities do, some don't. When they do, is that a barrier for non-Buddhists to join? There's sort of questions there. The celebration of Ambedkar Jayanti, there is some, as the ones that I've attended, there's an image of the Buddha. Maybe people talk a little bit about this, but it doesn't really go into the details of Buddhism very much. It's more of a celebration of culture. People dance and they sing and they give speeches and things, and Dr. Ambedkar is remembered. The thing that I just ask, for myself, because I'm kind of wondering, is especially in diaspora communities. I mean, you said, religion goes to fill a void. If we take Hinduism away, what fills the void? And maybe the void doesn't need to be filled nowadays. I think sort of ideas or trends towards secularization, the idea that people are not necessarily religious, or religious doesn't mean anything to them, it's not relevant. I do wonder what's sort of left there. And I'm not saying that in a totally critical way, that something has, there is a void, it has to be filled, and only religion can do it. I don't think that's true. But I do sort of wonder, when there is a sort of secular direction that's taken, what sort of cultural resources, what stories do people tell themselves that are going to be of sort of broad relevance, that are going to be like things that move people, that are going to have an emotional response? How is that all going to work out? I don't have an answer to that. I think, many people here in the audience, you're in the middle of living it. So like you're much closer to the answer than I am. And I'm sure you have lots of ideas about that. But I do think that, secularism by itself, a lot of religious studies scholars, like secularism's, it's not as clear as we think it is. Somehow the non-religious option. There's always something kind of going on a little bit underneath the surface of like people finding ways to bring themselves together, to form community bonds. We may not call it like Buddhist or Muslim or Christian or something. It may not have a religious name, but there's a function that kind of often is very parallel to that. And if we don't have language for that, if we can't name it, then sometimes it can kind of get out of control, or we're not even quite sure what's happening. So we can't even maybe strategically do it better. So that's where I think religion is still, or the study of religion can still be relevant, even if people are not saying, well, okay, we need to be Buddhist, or, we need to be Christian, or like we need to have some religion. Maybe being non-religious is totally fine too, but there's some dynamics there that religious studies language, I think, does get at. That's helpful. I hope that somewhat addresses your questions.
We'll take Iha Singh's question next. Do you want to go ahead and?
Yeah, if you don't mind, maybe I'll just read it. Is that okay?
Sure.
All right. As Ambedkarite Buddhism serves as a vehicle to transcend casteism and oppression in South Asia, predominantly Hindu society, how does the ideologies within Ambedkarite Buddhism change in Western countries where diaspora communities may not have the same connection to caste? This is a big question. And to my mind, the big kind of place where this occurs most strongly, and again, I'm sure people in the audience here have had, far more experience this than I, is the intergenerational question. What happens in the second and third generations? Like, what does it mean for a youngster to grow up in the U.S.? Or I was got to know a family quite well in Scotland, who now they are. The third generation is in college. And so Ambedkarite by background, but British by culture, and Scottish by culture. And like, what does Ambedkar mean in that context when that becomes increasingly kind of culturally obscure for them? If there's not a large community around to be remembering all of that, then the Buddhist piece comes to the fore. But what Buddhism means in Scotland has very little to do with Dr. Ambedkar. So, yeah. And on some level, like just as to my mind, and this might feel like kind of an offensive question, and I'm sorry if it is, if it sounds that way to some people, but for people to say escape caste, if the second and third generations grow up outside of India and they don't feel like the pressure of caste, and that some do, but many don't. If they've sort of escaped caste that way, is that success? Has that kind of fulfilled Dr. Ambedkar's vision? Maybe in part, obviously not entirely, but as an individual, like, did they escape? And it becomes then kind of a complicated question to say, well, if they escaped, but they still have to keep talking about it. Yeah, I don't know. I just have a lot of compassion for that. I don't have an answer for it, or no judgment on any side. But it's complicated. So yeah, diaspora communities, countries like Japan and Taiwan form strong bonds. Japan and Taiwan, anyone else, forms bonds with Nagpur or India or anything else, for very different kinds of reasons. I went to India for my own reasons and in college to see something very different than where I grew up with, and was transformed in the process. But that's not, the thing that everybody experiences. So all of these sort of come from very different kind of contextual backgrounds. It's hard to generalize all of that.
Thank you. Shreya, do you want to go forward next?
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Keune. That was a wonderful session. Actually, just picking up from the last point that you made, when the Ambedkarite community that has been overseas for many years, and especially the third generation, um, when you escape it, doesn't that it actually does also end up you lose your identity. You are escaping casteism, and then you're also letting go of all the what Ambedkar, Dr. Ambedkar meant for you, and what your caste struggle meant for you. Something I have noticed among people of my age is um, it's very difficult to actually connect with people either on the religious end or on the political end, the Ambedkarite movement. And then what way do you meet? What way do you connect with people? There's another point I'd just like to ask, because you've listed a number of challenges in this, what the diaspora faces. There's also this growing, it's another observation, this growing trend I see of there's a deep erosion of Buddhism and following Dr. Ambedkar in the newer generation. So either Dr. Ambedkar has been reduced to celebrating Ambedkar Jayanti, or because if you celebrate it and you do associate yourself with the community, that doesn't help you collaborate with pluralistic groups, whether they're Indians overseas or people from other countries. So this erosion is, in my opinion, increasing. And how, this is not just a question to you, sir, of course, it's also to the rest of the people here. How are we going to bring people back to it? I see more and more people convert, even in my family. Unfortunately, I've seen people who were earlier following Dr. Ambedkar or were outright Buddhist are now following Hindu ways, and they're coming back because they want to be better assimilated, and they feel like they've gained what they wanted from Dr. Ambedkar's teachings, or what the movement was giving them, whether it was reservation, whether it was some sort of community. But now you've reached a socio-economic level where education and financial, upward mobility has given them what they wanted, and now they're moving away, which is a very sad trend as well. So how do we see this challenge of people moving further into the Hindu fold to assimilate better? That is my broader question.
Yeah. Yeah, many layers of that question, and all of them are very poignant. So thank you for raising all of that. To the first question, as I jotted down here, what way do we connect with the people in diaspora, especially different generations? And I like the way that you referred to this as the erosion of some sort of Buddhist practice for the people who were Buddhist when they came to the U.S. Yeah, that's a serious challenge. So as it strikes me, this is just my perspective. Already within India, one of the big challenges of the people who had converted and other people who converted afterwards to Buddhism after 1956 was that although you had the Tri Ratna organization, they came in kind of trying to teach about Buddhism in a way, and sometimes was very sort of British oriented, and eventually it started to become more India centered. Because there wasn't a very stable organization with people who were thinking further about what it meant to be Buddhist in an Ambedkarite way, and Ambedkar's own project, I cautiously say, feels very unfinished. Like he even is in his own thinking. There's very limited writings, and he died relatively early after that conversion. Like they're just sort of getting started, and like somebody with Dr. Ambedkar's educational background and his intelligence just sort of penetrating globally and replicating that kind of a person was extremely difficult. And so like there was sort of a trajectory that kind of got going, and then people around didn't have the kind of resources to pick up exactly where he left off. And even now, among Ambedkarite Buddhists, and I say this very compassionately and cautiously, a lot of people have, they have to do their jobs. They have to be making money. They have to like finding ways to survive. They don't have a whole lot of time to be reflecting on, well, how do we think about what it means to be Buddhist in a more social activist way, and what does this mean now in the 21st century as opposed to 1956 when Dr. Ambedkar wrote. Those are problems. People do need to think about, well, what does this mean now versus then, or the diaspora context especially? What does it mean to be Ambedkarite Buddhist in diaspora? Because if we can't sort of start to think about as the second and third generations, then of course people aren't speaking to them on their own terms, because the diaspora, the second and third generations, they live functionally in a different culture. So I remember talking with some people in the UK where they said they had grown up in the UK, their parents were Ambedkarite leaders, and they had said that growing up in the UK, they always talking with their classmates and whatnot, people asked them, well, what does it mean that you are Buddhist? Like, what do you do? What do you believe? And so they would bring that back home and they would ask their parents. And that's not the kind of question that their parents were used to answering, right? They were activists. They got together. They were trying to mobilize. They were kind of changing their kind of place in life. It was activity that was at the center of this, and it's not a judgment. But the students or the youngsters were asking a different question that the parents really couldn't address. And not a surprise, like really any diaspora community, you've got that move where the parents grew up is really very, very different than where the children grow up. And so they're sometimes, they're speaking kind of past each other and not entirely even knowing how. So it's very complicated. And then not maybe so much a surprise, thinking about if an Ambedkarite student is going to school here in the US, and there's not a very large Ambedkarite population around. They're in a class with a lot of students who are not Indian. Let's just say, in many places, they're predominantly white. And then their white classmates see them as Indian, but don't have any sensitivity to like the Indian diversity. And so any other Indians, they just sort of get clubbed together. And so that does functionally become kind of their minority identity on the basis of ethnicity rather than on caste. And so that is what they experience. It's very different than what their parents would have experienced. And it almost becomes a little artificial to try to tell them something beyond what they're immediately experiencing with their classmates. So those are some complicated conversations, and Ambedkarite Buddhists are like suddenly right in the middle of this and experiencing it right now. And again, I just have tremendous compassion for the challenges they're facing. I don't know if I really have answers. I know I don't. I'll say it that way. And hopefully, in talking about it or things, people can at least find some maybe comfort in how these adaptations are going on, or maybe find some strategies for how they would do things a little bit consciously differently. In all of that, I won't go on too much longer about this. In all of that, I do have to say, one thing that impresses me very deeply about the way that even Ambedkar Jayanti events get organized, especially the Maharashtrians I've been around, they are very conscious to bring the children into the program, right? The children get up on stage, they sing a song, they dance, they give a speech, people clap, the children feel happy. That is a very, very strategic move. It's a wise move that the children are included in all of this. And this is not something that's sort of separate from them. Hopefully they have some good, some good experiences and memories of that. And that's something to build on, because you're meeting them where they're at. In addition to like trying to say, well, here's your culture, now practice it. That's impressed me.
So next question we can take from SK. He has a question about Buddhism regarding what yet to be in public discourse, especially radical criticism of Brahmanism, if I framed it correctly. Yeah, if
I
you
can
want to.
unpack a bit.
Please.
So Hi. So thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for the talk. It's very in-depth and engaging. So you explain about how the people, those who practice Buddhism, those who are not practicing Buddhism, what is their discussion or dialogue in the political space. This discourse is pretty much there, and a lot of literature also there. But however, what I feel, there is a radical side of Buddhism, especially with respect to how it criticized Brahmanism, not only the emancipation, but the origin of Brahmanism. For example, there was a debate among the Buddhists and with Buddha himself. Somebody is asking Buddha in so disparaging way that the Brahmins are claiming they born from mouth, and we born from the legs. That what's the answer? Then Buddha responded, no, it cannot be scientifically possible that every woman is going through the menstrual period and she has to get pregnant, and everybody comes through the birth canal, so nobody comes through mouth. But I have never heard, other than very close 4 or 5 people discussing such a discussion in the public discourse, how to bring such a radical side of Buddhism for the public discourse rather than being an echo chamber of discussing some things. Even we cannot find a solution of some of the points that you are discussing. We can agree to disagree with our friends. They are telling that what is the political edge of Buddhism. We can say agree, disagree. But what about a radical face of Buddhism?
If I understand like what you're asking and some of the maybe the background for it, and thank you for the text. Actually, I'll follow up after this event concludes. What it sounds to me like is sometimes as I've talked with Ambedkarites and say, well, how come say Americans don't take this more, like say, white Americans or Black Americans, how come they don't, take this plight of anti-caste more seriously? Why don't they care? How come, say, Japanese Buddhists don't seem to care about what Ambedkarites are facing? And your point about the radical nature of Buddhism, to my mind, it's an issue of how to bring things into conversation. And this is something that, at least the Ambedkarites I've spoken with, is something of a growing edge. And I'm not very familiar with the Ambedkar King Study Circle, but just the very name of this, the Ambedkar King Study Circle, I assume that, this is something that's going on there too. Like, how do you formulate the conversation and find conversation partners so that issues that, say, Dr. Ambedkar or Buddhism as he interprets it, how do you bring that into conversation with other people who don't already have some interest? And that sort of cross-cultural, cross-conceptual translation is sort of hard, but it also it requires a lot of knowledge about the people that you're hoping to talk to. Rather than just sort of hoping that they're going to immediately take an interest because it's inherently interesting or that it's important, trying to bring that across to, to communities who have no background, say with caste, and like try to meet them where they're at. That's a different kind of conversation than saying, well, Buddhism has an inherent radicality to it, and somehow it hasn't resonated. I think, how do we pursue that conversation? How I think they're when I talk to some Ambedkarite Buddhists, and I'm sure it's not just them, but when I talk to some of them, I get the impression like they're anticipating somebody ought to be interested, but I'm not seeing the interest call out first to like, well, where are you going to meet them? Like, where are you going to meet the people who don't have any previous background and like learn about them so that you can help to make that contact? That I think is important for bringing this issue of Buddhism's kind of radical anti-caste critique, bringing it more onto the table. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, next question we have from Pawan. He asks, why did you decide to research on this topic, and how will this research be helpful to Ambedkarite Buddhists?
Good question. So how I began, as I'd mentioned very briefly in the talk, One of my indirect teachers was Eleanor Elliott, and she was the sort of first international person to really study Dr. Ambedkar. So I'd been hearing about Dr. Ambedkar since college. Was obviously very interested and moved and compassionate towards people struggling against oppression in around the world in various places. And since I was going to India and in Maharashtra, it was just sort of obvious that I'd be kind of drawn into this. So that's part of how I got into the topic. And the transnational piece and cross-cultural translation, that was just always very interesting to me too. How is this helpful to Ambedkarite Buddhists? I'm hopeful it's helpful in the conversations, as I'm learning about what's happening in people's lives, hearing how they talk about it on their terms. I go to Ambedkar Jayanti events as a speaker, or Dhamma Chakrabarti Vartandin, or other, events, and even here, and I'm talking to people, sharing what I've seen, what other Ambedkarites have told me, reflecting on it somewhat in my terms that might not be the terms they use, and I'm hoping to add to the conversation. Someone who looks like me. There's a long history of people who look like me going to India and saying that they have all the answers, and I don't, right? So I want to avoid that. I hope to frame this as sort of community engaged scholarship. I definitely do not want to be sort of extracting information and then I go away and do my own thing for professional advancement. If people are being so open and sharing about their lives and important things to them, I want to be reflecting back to that in a very sort of careful way where I don't have answers, but just saying it in different words sometimes helps people think about it in a little bit different way. And I hope that that's helpful, but that's something that, really only the community can say whether it's helpful or not. I can't control that exactly, but I want to be helpful.
Thank you. If there is any particular question from the chat that you would like to engage with.
So there are, if I can kind of take a couple of the questions and move to a kind of response that maybe addresses them, at least as I understand them. So as people have been kind of asking about, well, how do we make these contacts, sort of how do we find a spiritual and rational common ground? This is always a challenge. I think two very practical things that I've just found relevant in my life, and I don't know if that's applicable to everyone, to people here or not, but one is that although we might be very interested in kind of religion and rational kind of spiritual, like all of these sort of like that's the goal of where we're going, there are lots of more very basic mundane pieces that are maybe more effective in connecting on first in order to get there. So like I go back to some of the research that I did before with the major Bhakti tradition in Maharashtra, the Wadkari tradition. And there I went on pilgrimage for a couple of weeks with people. And I was very interested about the religion side of things, but I think I spent probably 60, 70% of my time talking to the people on the pilgrimage about farming, because I came from a farming background. And so it was really making that connection first. And like that, people get engaged and they start opening up. And that allowed them to kind of be a little more open to questions and conversation about something, say, of a more spiritual or kind of deeper nature, because that farming connection had been made first. And I think we can't undervalue that, of like just making the human connection. Even if we want to talk about something else, we probably can't start with that very effectively because, well, especially say in Japan, that's very sort of off-putting. You just don't go there. You need to kind of build up the relationship to get there first. I'm kind of partial to sharing meals together. I think that's kind of still an important thing. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it's a good starting point. And just trying to figure out, making the connection of like, well, what is the person that I'm trying to talk with? What's driving them? Like, how do I meet them where they're at in order to move the conversation onto something else eventually? So I'm hoping that addresses a couple of the questions that are there.
I think there is one question from Rohit that I am also interested in. It's
Sure.
about the embodiment of nature of solidarity. So he asked, you spoke about the embodied nature of solidarity, that shared practice binds communities more deeply than shared belief. Within Navayana, we often debate what such shared practices should be: meditation, community services, public remembrance. Based on your interactions, what kinds of embodied practices seem to sustain Ambedkarite moral community most powerfully?
So great question. I mean, very functionally, especially diaspora communities, and because it's different in India where you've got a lot of people together. Diaspora, where the numbers work out differently. There's sort of a different dynamic. In diaspora, I mean, I think the obvious answer right away are the celebrations of like Ambedkar Jayanti and the Dhammachakra Parivartan Din. So it's the gatherings, it's the social gatherings. That's the starting point. And I know within the community, there are a lot of different ideas about the value of that. And some people say, well, it's just people getting together and, singing and dancing, they go home and they haven't changed it all. I get the criticism there, but I think that might be undervaluing the social bonds that do happen there. These are, 2 or maybe 3 events out of the year. But yeah, and I know they're very complicated and time intensive and labor intensive to organize. But that's one place where just functionally, people have kind of come together. Do they sustain the moral community powerfully? I think there's ways in which maybe it could be more powerful than it is, but it's something right now. And here with the Ambedkar King Study Circle, other kinds of groups, I know the Ambedkar Association North America, there's the Boston Study Group, there's groups around who meet periodically virtually, which is definitely good if that's the only way we can do it. But meeting in person is more embodied, and allows you to kind of there's just more levels on which we meet each other when that occurs. That's an important piece. Reading together, I think I'm a teacher. I'm partial to that. I think reading together is important. But I know that doesn't resonate with absolutely everybody, and I wouldn't want that to become in some ways almost an elitist kind of thing, like that people who only have the luxury of high education can really get into that. At the same time, for those of us who have, I think it is meaningful and we should activate that. So yeah, the community service piece, I like the idea of that. And I'm sure that many of you have ideas about, how that has been carried out and, whether it's been successful or not. But I would think that would be a very kind of activity-oriented, very embodied way of doing something. If it's especially towards people who might not have connection to the community. Yeah, they're sort of kind of broadening the horizon. That might also function to bring the community together. Those are just some thoughts. I'm not sure how much that applies to people or what people think about that, but that's what comes to my mind.
Thank you, Professor. I think we have to wrap up soon, unfortunately, but thank you so much for the talk, and thanks to the audience for such wonderful questions. And I'm sure you guys have a lot more questions to ask and to discuss, but feel free to send him an email, send any of us an email just to discuss more. We would love to do that. And yeah, if you have any concluding remarks, Professor, go ahead and we'll end the session.
I would just say thanks to you all who invited me to do this. Thank you to the audience members. It's these kinds of conversations that they're really energizing for me. I really enjoy this research because it's connecting with people. Yeah, I thank you for sharing your lives with me, sharing your perspectives, the challenges you're facing. Even if we don't have clear solutions, just the bravery of sharing about it is necessary and important. And I appreciate that you allowed me into the challenges of your lives, and you're willing to share them with me. So yeah, thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.